All right. Okay, we are going to talk about trust. Woo. Yeah. What everyone's been waiting for. Everyone can agree that trust is essential when it comes to accessing patient healthcare data. Recent disputes over patient privacy, interpretation of policy, and allegations of inappropriate requests for data have rattled our industry, and I think everyone can agree that's putting it lightly. Today's panel will unpack how TEFCA and Carequality are responding, and we're also going to dig into eHealth Exchange's enhanced trust guidelines that are meant to enhance trust, increase transparency, and protect patient privacy. So now we have that out of the way. We'd really like this to be a collaborative panel, so if you have questions, please raise your hand. This is a really important topic. So we'll get started with each of the panelists telling us a little bit about themselves, the organization that they represent, and then who or what has oversight over your network or framework. Alan, you want to start?
Yes, I will start. And you might need to shout if you're on the sides and you're trying to raise your hand, because I otherwise can't see you. Those lights are right there.
Real bright.
It is very bright. But I am Alan Swenson, the Executive Director of Carequality. And I have been with Carequality for about 3.5 years now, though I was involved in the creation of Carequality and represented a couple of different implementers before that, and moving over to actually lead Carequality. So been involved in it since the creation. Very excited to still be pushing all of these things forward and solving all of the trust issues that have come up. eHealth Exchange obviously has been a long time implementer of Carequality, participating in exchange with other implementers leveraging the Carequality framework. As far as the governance and who oversees Carequality, so Carequality is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're our own separate organization with a board. The board obviously does the things that a board does. However, we are a little different than a lot of organizations might otherwise be structured, in that the board of directors of Carequality carves out a lot of the actual responsibility for the Carequality framework to a steering committee. And so there is a steering committee. It's 18 members, largely representing organizations in the that participate in Carequality Exchange, implementers, connections, as well as other stakeholder groups, such as federal agencies and things like that, to ultimately oversee and have the governing authority over the things that Carequality does. We then have an advisory council that makes recommendations up to the steering committee and any number of work groups and subcommittees and all sorts of other things, depending on the work that needs to be done.
Great.
Hi, I'm Mariann Yeager. I am CEO of the Sequoia project. I think I'm here today primarily in the role of leading the Recognized Coordinating Entity team for the ASTP ONC Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, TEFCA. TEFCA is really interesting in terms of a governance approach because of the government's role. So ONC has ultimate authority in making decisions in TEFCA, and it is their program. We work with ONC under a contract, so we're really more a coordinating role. We are working right now on a transitional interim governance for TEFCA, on which Matt serves, and Amy, you're involved in all these groups. We'll be moving from a transitional council to a governing council with representatives from QHIN's participants and sub-participants, and in the process of actually going through nominations on who's going to serve on the QHIN caucus and who is going to serve on the participant sub-participant caucus, and that's really where voting approvals occur. And all that rolls up, of course, with a recommendation to ONC. So very important. I will say that we understand there is so much interest in people having a voice and input into TEFCA, and so we will be expanding and formalizing additional ways so that there is ongoing feedback and opportunities. The pace at which ASTP has us working oftentimes limited the ability to get feedback from external stakeholders, and that's something we've heard, and we're going to be formalizing again to give folks additional voice in that.
Thanks. I'm Matt Eisenberg. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the Associate Chief Medical Information Officer at Standford Healthcare. And like Alan, I feel like I'm, where were you on the night of the 34th with the lights? So sorry about that. Has anybody seen Gutenberg the musical? So it's a hysterical story about the Gutenberg Bible. It's two actors, and they play like 14 different roles, and every time you know which role they are because they change their hats. That's what I feel like. So I represent Standford Healthcare, and I help lead our interoperability work at a provider level. As you know, I'm also the chair of the coordinating committee, the group at the eHealth Exchange that manages the network. And the board takes care of the business. And the coordinating committee was formed as part of the DRSA, and I think I've said it here before, Steve Gravely is our own Thomas Jefferson. So Steve Gravely helped write that. So I represent the eHealth Exchange. I also at Stanford am actually a participant in the Epic Nexus QHIN. I had a choice. We've talked about my choices, and we can talk about our QHIN choices, and our QHIN choices I think is something that's going to come up over the course of this week. I have talked about a QHIN selection app called QHinder, which doesn't exist, but I'm looking to build that, where you swipe left for those you don't want and right for the ones you want. So I am a participant of the Epic Nexus QHIN. And so I have a ton of hats, work with the coordinating committee. As a participant, and one of the earliest participants in the Epic Nexus QHIN, I was fortunate to also be nominated to this transitional council. And we're going to get voted off the island this year. It was supposed to be transitional. The standard operating procedure for governance is coming, and like ONC usually does, we'll put it out right around Christmas time, which will be great. I guess ASTP now, which I call always sabotaging holiday travel plans. ASTP, that's it. So I represent the QHIN there. There's also been, we'll talk about it, a policy and technology advisory group. I help work with that. Michael Saito from Epic helps lead that group. And I'm a board member of the Sequoia Project, a proud board member of the Sequoia Project. And as I think you'll hear, this is a long journey for me, but a really wonderful journey.
Great. My name's Amy Bagge-Smith. I work for Zeus Health. We are a data interoperability and platform serving provider organizations. So, okay, we're going to dig in. Matt, I'm going to require you somehow incorporate queuingdom of heaven into your answer. But you have decades of experience in the healthcare data interoperability space and have helped eHealth Exchange grow and evolve since 2014. Can you provide us a quick overview of kind of the current regulatory landscape, including TEFCA, as well as the history of eHealth Exchange?
Yes. I read this question that we talked about previously, and I thought, gosh, that's just because I'm the oldest geezer on the panel, and I'm like older than dirt, so I remember all this stuff. So I wrote it all down. Okay. And I'll do my best, but we've lived it together, many of us, so let's see if we can talk about the arc, and we've talked about it. So if you were at the ASTP meetings last year, ASTP celebrated 20 years. They were formed in 2004. David Brailer was the first national coordinator, and it was under the Bush administration. And if you want to go back, you can listen to George Bush's State of the Union, where he talked about the need for that. The nationwide health information network was set up by the ONC in 2006. So if you're feeling a little deja vu for you ONC folks, no surprise, because you already did this once. And the Nationwide Health Information Network, really, and I've talked about this previously, with what's called VELR, the Virtual Lifetime Electronic Record, really was trying to solve a big, hairy problem, which is getting the DoD and the VA to talk to one another, so that active duty members, if they became veterans, the health would work. And since a lot of their health care was being given elsewhere outside of those systems, how did we do the interoperability? The Nationwide Health Information Network became the eHealth Exchange. In 2008, we've talked about it, 2009, we had 23 members, and I was very fortunate because at the time I worked for Multicare Health System in Washington, it's referenced earlier today, and we were one of the early VELR users because Madigan Health System was just down the road. So that was the eHealth Exchange. By the way, 2008 was also the first year of the Care Everywhere Epic-supported vendor network. Alan knows a little bit about that. And we at Stanford joined that in 2010. So this arc continues. We talked about reciprocity in the DRSA. You'll see how that plays all the way through in this arc. So fast forward, 2014, I'm at the HIMSS meeting and we're trying to explain Carequality. It's not a network, it's a framework, right? What the hell is that, right? T-Mobile can talk to Verizon. That's what the framework's about. And Carequality was established. We joined Carequality in 2014 at Standford. And then 21st Century Cures Act. Here we are, it's 2016 under the Obama administration. All of this stuff now is codified in law. Now what? TEFCA version 1 comes out. Does anybody remember TEFCA version 1? That was like the book nobody ever read, 2018. TEFCA version 1. RCE gets named, I think it's 2019. 2022, the first common agreement and the QTF come out in early January of 2022. Within 2 years, December last year, we had our first designated 5 QHINs. And that was very exciting. Now we have 7 QHINs. And 2 more waiting in the wings, 3 more actually. 2 are pretty close to being on board. And here we are growing it. And all of that work about getting additional operating procedures, the next version of the Common Agreement, has been a journey for us all of this year, and one which we'll share more about.
Okay. Tina, is there a slide that kind of visualizes kind of that arc that we can just have up so that, yeah, there we go. The old history. Okay.
It's like Mike, this is your life in HIE, so there it is.
All right. Alan, Carequality is the first national framework that has had to dust off its dispute resolution process. There are many times in life where being first is pretty fantastic, but I'm guessing this is not one of those times. Can you share what you've learned through the dispute resolution process that happened over the last year?
Yeah, and agreed. This was definitely not the ideal thing to be first at. I was actually just reading in a fantasy series that I'm reading, and there was this whole monologue from one of the characters about how the most important thing is novelty and being first. And no matter how great of a piece of art you make or how great of a musical composition or whatever, if you're the second one to do it, nobody cares. It's being first is actually more important than being creative or inventive or whatever else. In this case, being first was not so great. Carequality, as was just talked about, we put this, all together back in 2014. The first exchange was in 2016. Took a couple years to get things up and moving. But we're now to the point that we have more than 1 billion, with a B, clinical documents being exchanged on a monthly basis. So picture that arc there. And this was the first dispute. So yeah, it wasn't great to be first. At the same time, it took 10 years to get to the first, from 2014 being created and putting this dispute resolution process together. And at that time, it was a known process of something that we would hopefully never have to use. But here's how we will deal with disputes should they come up. And that document largely sat untouched for 10 years. There is definitely a lot that we learned from going through that first dispute. The Carequality governing bodies are certainly in discussion of, how do we now update the dispute resolution process? So that is something that the Carequality Steering Committee is discussing and is looking at. Having gone through it, we didn't want to change anything while going through the dispute, right? We had a process, it was defined, we're gonna follow the process as it is defined, and that is what we did. We followed the process exactly as it is laid out, all of the timelines, all of the steps, everything, even as we were sometimes scratching our heads and thinking, why did we say that it had to be done this way? But we're gonna go ahead and do it because that's what it says. And we did it. We survived it. We came out on the other side, and now here we are talking about trust and how do we, ensure that everybody can trust each other with all these things that are going on. But there are a lot of lessons that we learned from it, and looking at how can we now go back and improve this process to make it better, again, hoping that we never have to use it again. But should we have to use it again, now that we've actually done it, how can we make it work better for the next time, which hopefully isn't for another 10 years. Some of those are around transparency. A lot of the difficulties that we had, and I'm sure many of you in the room probably saw things that were going on in the course of this dispute. There was a lot, the difficulty that we had was that the intention of this process was that it was a closed process. 2 parties who have a dispute come in, file the dispute, file their response to the dispute, have a panel get together, receive information, review the information, go through it. Steering committee has a final decision at the end. We communicate out publicly what that final decision was, and move on from there. Unfortunately, there was a whole lot of talking about the things that were going on, and much of the information that was shared online was incorrect, was partial, based on partial understanding of what was going on, or sometimes complete lack of understanding of what was going on. But there was very little that we could do to correct any information or share more information about here's what's actually happening, because we weren't supposed to be talking about it at all. And that made it very difficult. So one of the things that we have discussed, and we'll see where all of this goes with the implementer community and the steering committee, but one of the things we've discussed is, should this instead be the exact opposite direction? And should it be transparent? Should it be, we publicly share that a dispute was filed, and here's what's going on, and here's how we're handling it? And maybe some of this could be a situation where sharing too much information early on is not what we want to do, but I think there's a balance there. And there's definitely a desire, and I think when we're talking about trust, how do we ensure that there's trust? Well, people need to know what's going on. And I think one of the big lessons that we learned from the dispute process was that not sharing what was going on and causing people to jump to assumptions about what was going on, largely based on misinformation or partial information being shared, was very damaging to trust. And so how can we ensure that the process does what the process needs to do and not disrupt that process that needs to be able to resolve an issue, whatever that issue is, but at the same time not hurt trust by making it appear like something is happening in secret, nobody knows what's going on, but people are talking about it when they shouldn't be, and all of that balance of trust and transparency. I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways from going through it, and again, is definitely something that we have learned lessons from and will be making updates to the Carequality dispute resolution process to hopefully adjust that for any future disputes, again, which hopefully we don't need for another 10 years, but we'll see.
All right, thanks, Alan. Mariann, based on the learnings from the Carequality dispute, what are the RCE's plans, or what has the RCE already put in place for building and sustaining trust on TEFCA?
I think it's important to take note, and Matt, thank you for the timeline, because it does remind me of how far we've come. Back circa 2008, the policy to point to TEFCA, or HIPAA definition of treatment, was a policy established by ONC in 2008. And I was actually part of the discussion because I was a contractor at the time, and met with them and said, hey, how do we, because there's this obligation to respond to treatment, HIPAA treatment, that's pretty broad. And, at that time, the participants in the network were pretty homogenous. There were HIEs, healthcare providers, and government agencies. Vendor, their role was as a technology enabler. They were not participants. They didn't have rights to the data. Fast forward, as again, the same paradigm has been in place the last 16 years. But what happened during that time? What happened during that time is that health information exchange became more ubiquitous, so more and more data is flowing. The numbers in Carequality is just the transaction volumes between networks. It doesn't count the volumes within the eHealth exchange and other networks, which is, again, astounding. And then what also happened was there was value to the data. And what happens in our country when there's business value? New market entrants come in, right? And then all of a sudden, this paradigm, this long-standing, mature, tried and true policy was tested. Because then it became very interpretive about and there were different expectations, different thresholds for risk, and different legal interpretations that I'll tell you, they're not just issues in Carequality. There are dozens of issues. They're in every regional and statewide HIE and national network that we've ever talked to. And so to think that this is just an anomaly is not really the case. I think it's more of an evolution and reflective of where we are. So TEFCA, recognizing that, there's an opportunity and a role for government to help navigate this really, really tricky, really, really nuanced considerations. And so what TEFCA has been putting forward is to narrow the scope of when you have to respond to treatment requests. And really, it's walking back a policy that's 16 years old, right? Think about that. And that is to meet the market and meet the participants where their threshold for trust is, and to build up from there. So we'll expand that over time. There was additional need and interest in having some objective criteria to vet connections so that there is transparency and clarity, and that assurance, again, of consistency and interpretation. That process has been implemented, you would know this, a couple weeks now. Yeah.
3-4 weeks.
3-4 weeks. So again, that had never occurred before because everybody just assumed whatever the network was, they did their vetting. Well, guess what? There is not consistency in vetting, and so there is now an interest in centralizing that. Another concept which is really important is there are certain parties that are delegates or intermediaries and that initiate queries on behalf of a treatment provider rather than relying on an attestation from the delegate, the vendor or service provider. Now there's an expectation of, no, that attestation has to come from a healthcare provider organization. So all of these things in combination were really important to address. And I will tell you that it's super early. These are operational level policies. It's a starter set. We're going to learning every single solitary day. Like literally, our C team meets every single day because there's always something. And it just goes to show you can have the most brilliant minds in the room and government facilitation, and we're going to learn and adapt over time. And so we do, we'll be doing a lot more education and outreach and getting input on this to get more eyes on it, to the point that Alan was made about transparency.
Great. As related to kind of trust and the vetting process generally, I recommend you go to the Health IT Buzz blog. Mariann and Mickey just actually dropped a new blog this morning about this very, very issue. So take a look. Alan, okay, so Mariann just explained how TEFCA plans to address and build trust, and I know you talked about potentially updating some of the dispute resolution guidelines. But what is Carequality doing to foster trust as you move forward?
Yeah, I think a lot of things. And again, the Carequality Steering Committee, a lot of this is really high priority. Trust, transparency, how do we make sure people know what's going on, what we're doing, and that everybody can trust and exchange with each other. We are definitely looking at the work that's been going on in TEFCA. And obviously we've gone through the dispute process, and so making updates to that process, having learned the lessons from going through it. But TEFCA, as Mariann was talking about, TEFCA has incorporated a new definition for what's required of exchange when you're exchanging for treatment. One of the definite major issues, not just with the dispute that Carequality saw, but many issues that we see and continue to have discussions and not leading to any further disputes, hopefully, but the idea that treatment as defined in HIPAA, I mean, I'm sure a number of people in this room have probably read HIPAA, but you get everybody all together who's read HIPAA, you probably don't actually think it says the same thing. You probably all had the same experience I have. I bite my tongue every time, but I swear every time I go to the doctor's office and they say, here's your HIPAA form, which basically just says, whatever they say next is probably not what HIPAA actually says. And I'm like, okay, well, whatever, I'll sign the form. It's complicated. And so TEFCA has gone to a new definition that still relies on being covered entities and things like that, but further defines and gives these are the types of providers that are doing TEFCA required treatment, and here are even the activities of those types of providers that qualify them to request information under that definition, rather than just the broad, yeah, I'm doing treatment as defined in HIPAA, because I don't think that we have necessarily, and there certainly have been some major issues with specific organizations, but I don't think that we have a bad actor problem. We have it's a really broad definition, and people are trying to do the most they can to ensure that they meet the definition so that they can benefit from saying, well, no, I'm doing what's in applicable law. That's what the definition says, and that's what I'm doing. And there's a whole lot of gray area on the sides outside of the physical doctor sitting in an office talking to a patient face to face. And then there's a whole lot of gray area that's still arguably within that definition. And so that is also something that Carequality is looking at, to see where the definition and the vetting process and all of that kind of stuff goes with TEFCA, and what of that should we incorporate back into Carequality. I mean, it would be great if maybe someday we'll get a HIPAA 2.0 that actually aligns with all of the electronic information that's going on. There's so many other issues with HIPAA we could have a whole other panel about. But we're going to do what we can based on what we've seen, the issues that we saw, and again, some of the things that TEFCA has already incorporated, see how that goes and what we need to incorporate back into Carequality from it.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's change gears slightly and talk about eHealth Exchange. So I think as most people know, eHealth Exchange actively participates in both Carequality and TEFCA. As we mentioned, Matt mentioned in his opening remarks, there are a lot of steps, trust guardrails that eHealth Exchange is putting in place. So can you tell us a little bit more about the steps that you're taking to address, concerns about trust and transparency?
Yeah, so this slide is all over the place and is a wonderful summary. But let me back up a little bit, because I want to first, and I said this last week when we were at the ASTP meetings. So the 5 original designated QHINs, Epic Nexus, eHealth Exchange, MedAllies, Kanza, and Health Gorilla, now joined by Know2 and Commonwealth, have been meeting every Friday for a year. And one of the T-shirts that I want to have made is relentlessly moving to must. Because a lot of this has been about shall.
Right.
And we know we want to get to must, but right now it's shall. And building of trust, and Kate Riccobona has said this, there's TEFCA without trust is EFCA, which is useless, so we need that trust. Thank you, Kate. She and I are also writing TEFCA the musical, which should come out next year. We've met every week. We've had 11 of 12 transitional council meetings. We had 3 in-person meetings. The ONC showed up at all of them. Mariann and the RCE have been incredible. They have to, I don't know how many SOPs have been written and released, but it's too many for me to remember.
Too many for us to write.
Too many for them to write. Too many for you to read. But it has been remarkably collaborative. We've learned, I think, importantly, how to build that trust and put steps in place to do it, which is one that I talked about. So vetting. Who are you exchanging with? What is their business role? Treatment now in the post-pandemic era, we've got tons of places that are basically all virtual care delivery systems. That's all they do. Behavioral health care delivery virtually is all done. They may very well be a covered entity, but it's not sort of the traditional treatment that we remember. There are other care management groups that help with diabetes management that are supporting care delivery. Are they part of that original HIPAA definition that we're all good with? And the limited treatment in TEFCA, the TEFCA treatment, was a way for us to relentlessly move to must. Start with, you must respond for that treatment. Everything else is okay, and we'll work through that over time. So vetting now, we vet we talked about it this morning, all of our new applicants. Who's in your participant group? Are you delegating authority for query? And if so, where? What kind of operations do you do? What kind of treatment do you deliver? Is it a bricks and mortar treatment, or is it a new kind of delivery system? We're going back with our existing participants to verify all of that as well. And now there's a regular vetting process for TEFCA that has been established. It will be mimicked with us, with the eHealth Exchange, with our participants, and Carequality, I think, as well. Measurement. We've talked a lot about that. If it's going to be required to be reciprocal for treatment, is it? You got to go and look. You got to go and find out. If it's not and you're not so sure, or your data shows something else, ask a question. If you see something, say something. Let's look at that, and let's work at that collaboratively. We also want to bake this into the technology in 2 ways. One is the directory. The directory really needs to tell us who you're exchanging with, literally down to very, very low levels, particularly delegation. We've had tons and tons and tons of conversations about the directory. And then even baking it into the actual messaging, the transactions. How do we do that? And we have a new policy and procedure on the eHealth Exchange, OPP 17, which I'm sure you've all read in detail, that talks about that. But that's going to take time to get it to everybody's platform so that the transaction has that transparency. So I think that collaboration and what we've learned this year as we've established TEFCA, and I congratulate all of the early designated QHINs. They have been all in on this. I mean, Mariann can talk about it. I think we are all aligned that in order to relentlessly move to must, that level of trust needs to be built. It needs to be established incrementally, and we'll get there as a team.
Great. Okay, we have intentionally left some time for questions. Questions or concerns or suggestions. Would love to get some feedback from the room. We have 3 individuals up here that have an incredible amount of knowledge and are doing a lot of hard work on the trust issue. No one has any questions? There we go.
Also, many of you in the room have participated in 100 of these meetings. So if you would love to share your experience, whether that actually resonates, feel free. I think that would be helpful.
So my question is about, I keep hoping that 2025 is the year of individual access services really, really working. I'd love to hear your opinions on whether you think that's going to enhance trust or make trust challenging.
Well, IAS is tricky in that everybody knows and recognizes that we all want access to our own information, right? And how important it is, and we all pretty much understand why then requests for individual access are not responded to. I think the hope is with FHIR-based exchange that will materialize in a substantive way. I think it's going to take a while to get there, but there is, in TEFCA, you have to respond to IAS queries. So one thing we didn't talk about in terms of trust enhancements is it's one thing to have a set of guardrails. It's another thing to monitor and for compliance and enforcement. We talk about this all the time. We have all these requirements, but if somebody's not following the rules, when can we drop the hammer, right? I will tell you, we are looking very seriously in TEFCA at how we will monitor and for compliance as well as subsequent enforcement, but that's going to take a lot more discussion, definition. We haven't even brought it up to the governing council, but it's coming. And I think that's where we're going to have to start seeing that if people are not responding to IS queries, then why? And then we're going to have to investigate it.
So I think individual access is critical and the consumer voice is important. We're going to be talking about that at the Sequoia project meetings as well. First, I think Common Agreement 2.0 included the ability for us at Standford. So we were very excited early on with the FHIR APIs, and I'm in Silicon Valley, so if you can't get your data to your Apple Health app, we're in trouble. So or your Google app, and we were early on in that, and now we can use OAuth through our standard workflows to support IAS. So I'm all for it, and I think we really need to talk to everybody. I talked about this last week. If my kids could use their portal as well as use OpenTable, fantastic. That would be great. I think that's something we all need to talk about. We all need to teach people how to use them effectively and aggregate that data. So I think we are moving ahead, and IAS will go forward. I think 2025 is going to be a lot about identity management. Yeah. How do we do identity management? How are we going to trust that identity management through other parties? And we're going to talk a lot about that in 2025.
I agree with everything that was said. I'll tell you my concern. The issue, one of the issues, many issues, but one of the big issues with treatment. Treatment is the only exchange purpose in Carequality that you're required to respond to. And so, again, my comment that I don't think that we have an issue with, a whole bunch of bad actors. Rather, it's people trying to fit into the exchange purpose that they know they'll get a required response for. And so sometimes we'll see an organization that, well, what you're really doing is probably, healthcare operations. And there's a lot of overlap between those two definitions in HIPAA. And that makes things complicated. But, you're really doing healthcare operations versus this what you're doing is okay in treatment or things like that. But there is an incentive to justify that what I'm doing is treatment. Because if I can call it treatment, I know I get a response. If I have to call it healthcare operations, I'm probably going to get very little. Adding IAS just gives another exchange purpose that has a required response. And I agree that we want to make sure individuals have access to all their information. I have several different apps on my phone for connecting them. Actually, the Samsung Health just recently added in Be Well connector, so I'm signed up with Be Well and testing all of that out directly in Samsung Health to compete with Apple and Google and all the others. And there's all sorts of cool stuff going on with individual access. Are we going to be okay anytime an app comes forward and says, well, the individual clicked the button, so this is individual access services? And I think that we might see some interesting things and have some interesting discussions of, well, you're really trying to do research. Well, but the patient clicked the button, so it's individual access services. I don't know. We'll see. I think that we're probably going to see more and more of that in 2025 and beyond, where we're going to have some major discussions of, is there a point where it's no longer actually in the bucket of individual access services, even though the patient themselves was involved?
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Not all use cases are created equally. They're different. And most of our healthcare consumers are not HIPAA lawyers.
Right.
Yeah.
I saw a couple other hands over here.
I loved the history lesson at the beginning of this because I think people forget about the National Health Information Network, and I think it's so illustrative of where we've come. And as we continue to evolve, and as Carequality kind of aligns with what TEFCA is already doing, given that Carequality is a framework just like TEFCA, I'm just curious, as the steering committee for Carequality, thinking about, do we still need Carequality as we see an uptake on TEFCA? Does it make sense to have people split resources between two different frameworks that are very, very similar, but also different?
That is a great question, and if anybody happens to be attending the Sequoia and Carequality annual meetings, it's still in this same location the next couple days, or you've got the steering committee chair sitting right behind you, you could ask him that question. It is a great question. It is one that the steering committee is absolutely talking about, of what is the future of Carequality look like, and what is, we've talked about and even put up blog about, aligning with TEFCA, and what do we mean when we say we're aligning with TEFCA? Is there a future where we have both of these things continuing side by side and doing different things? Is there a future where Carequality eventually goes away? Well, what's the future of TEFCA going to look like next year is probably also a question that some have. So there is a lot that the steering committee is definitely talking about. And more to come, definitely. I would say that the steering committee is, intending to put out, publicly some of its plans and decisions here in the next few months. So we'll be talking about that a lot with the steering committee, hoping to have some priorities and things out by the end of the year, but definitely more to come in Q1 2025.
There are a lot of unknowns, obviously. We had an election. There are how many implementers on Carequality?
50 some odd.
50 some odd, and we have 7 active QHINs, 2, 3 in the pipeline.
We just have one additional one was designated, so it's 8 now.
We don't know if we're going to go from 9 to 50 or not, and how we're going to go, and I don't think that will actually work, right? That won't work. So, Carequality for us at Standford Healthcare was an incredible advantage to that last mile problem. Small practices in our community on Athena Health or eClinicalWorks, and we couldn't otherwise access that information. So I think these are going to be tough challenges for us as we build a new framework to figure out how do we leverage the old framework, like we talked in other areas. How do you go from new to old, but take what you need and use what's in old that still works and not? But I think that's going to be a job for all of us this coming year.
I agree. And just to add on, TEFCA is in the very, very early stages of rollout. In the month of October, there were 3.3 million documents exchanged. In Carequality, there were 1 billion.
Yeah, 1,077 million.
So, like anything, two like things may not coexist in the market for long, but there obviously is, things need to be fleshed out, and you just adapt as you go. Frankly, that's what we've done for the past 16 years. There have always been unknowns. Remember, NHIN was an ONC program, and then it was launched to the private sector, now eHealth Exchange. Market adapted, Carequality came to be, okay, cures, maybe there's a role for government. And the one thing I always just remind myself, and I try to channel this, is we got to be able to navigate the unknowns and just not just hand-wringing and worrying and assuming I think we need to leave open the possibilities and just use our brains and common sense and, move forward as we have for the past decade.
And I follow Mariann wherever she goes. I do whatever she tells me because she's been there every step of the way, and she's so knowledgeable about that.
Troy Kaji from Contra Costa. I'm going to ask you a crystal ball type question. It won't be as bad as it sounds, but
Boy, big build-up, Troy.
all of us, the usual internet search from the early 2000s, which was great. You could find anything, to now everything's behind a paywall, everything's determined by online auctions and that sort of thing. What I'm wondering is whether the way you structured the public square for, interoperability with the SOPs and governance structures you have in place, will that make it slightly more resistant to surveillance capitalism than the rest of the internet? Because it is such valuable information. And so you do have those same actors who have that same motivation to squeeze the value out of it. So I don't really ask you for a definitive answer, but I just want to know your impressions on that. Thank you.
I think that's why we're doing everything we've been doing, and that it's not enough to have gating mechanisms. It's going to have to be ongoing monitoring and compliance with some actual teeth and enforcement. And we didn't talk about this. It's everything from policy process review to having complaint and issue resolution. Heaven forbid we have another dispute, but guarantee we will. But also being able to drill down into directory and do some proactive surveillance.
All right, well, unless there's any question that can be answered in 1 minute, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Let's give our panel a round of applause, please. Thank you, and thank you for doing all you're doing for trust.